Reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity, this is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent.
Hello everybody and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host Cora. Thank you so very much for joining me. It is wonderful to see you. Hop on in here. Let's talk about gender some more. Why not? What is it, a Wednesday? Let's do it. And this week, much like we do every time we come together, we take a confident declaration from a public figure or a famous book author or Donald Trump or J.D. Vance, let's face it, and we take their often confidently declared statements for the questions we're sure they're intended to be, because of course, come on, the questions, right? And we take their confident declarations of questions we expect them to be, and we see if we can't look to the literature to find an answer together. And it is wonderful to see you. Here we are, episode 38. We're now heard in 30 countries, Classroom Psychology. So from all my wonderful friends worldwide, it is wonderful to have you as part of our community. Thanks so very much for joining us. And I've been receiving some mail recently, people emailing in at the University of Southampton, or they have been DMing me on Blue Sky or on, X a little bit, and saying hi. And they've been universally very positive and very warm. So thanks so much for getting in touch. Please don't hesitate. You ever want to say hi? Listen, in these trying times, y'all are like, you lift me up. That's what you do. You lift me up, and I feel good whenever you get in touch in a big way. So please do. And hey, it's a wild ride. It's a wild ride right now with Donald Trump becoming the president of the United States. For all my US friends and family out there, it's a tough time. It's a tough time, particularly if you are gender diverse, or honestly, if you are any marginalized population in the States right now. It's a tough time. And just know that my heart goes out to you. We're thinking of you. And we're all a bit scared right now, I think. We're all a bit scared for a couple of reasons. There's been a couple of really big moves from the United States. One of the biggest seems to be that they have, especially if you are a scientist in this field, Donald Trump has invited the CDC to withdraw and prohibit the publication of any journal article that uses any of a number of banned words. And those banned words include transgender or non-binary or assigned, gender assigned at birth, or pregnant person. It's pretty scary stuff, honestly. So it's going to be harder in the US to publish. I imagine this is going to be, it doesn't affect all journals, of course, not by a long way, but it could easily have a bit of a chilling effect on the field. Yeah, that's a bit dicey if you are working in this field, in the gender diversity science field, not that big that we are. And of course, Donald Trump removing the X from passports. So the government only recognizing two genders, male and female, and considering that you are the gender you were assigned at birth regardless. Which is frightening. People having difficulty renewing their passports, trans folks having those passports not be renewed, so losing access to their passports in a couple of cases by the scheme of things. But I mean, it's all chaos. It's all chaos and crisis, and the community is fearful for its healthcare, fearful for all of it. And I'm with you, and it's affecting me too. And you may have heard, I'm training my voice a little better. I've started voice training again, which I hadn't done for a long time. I had become more comfortable with a voice that was a little deeper. The intro to the podcast is a little bit deeper, isn't it? It's deliberate that I do my boy voice for the intro, just because it was a play on words, a play on speech, I guess. I've been getting voice training. It's been a journey. We're going to do an episode on voice training at some point, and I have been recording myself every day that I do my voice training so that you can see it and you can see the change for yourself. No doubt, right, still early in voice training, my voice is going to descend as the episode progresses. But, hey, as my voice gets tired, but hey, I know you good, kind people will look upon me with generosity as we go through this together. Of course, not only does huge changes in the United States with Trump, there's also, Wes Streeting in the UK is continuing to be quite challenging when it comes to his support for the trans community, I would argue. And so the UK is not looking particularly rosy either. And for all of us worldwide, I think we're all seeing a kind of right-wing populist growth, which is making it hard for the trans community to exist in peace, which is really, really challenging. So I guess my point is, if you're out there and you're feeling a little alone or you're feeling quite scared, just know that you are not alone, that we are all a little scared and we are all going to pull together and we're going to keep doing what we're doing and we're going to do some good stuff. And the news isn't all bad. When we did our 3 episodes of the cast review, we were criticizing the cast review. For those who don't know, the cast review is the UK's review of gender identity services for children and young people in the UK, gender identity development services. And it was quite critical of the use of puberty blocking medications and gender affirming hormones because it was citing a limitation of the evidence. We were pretty critical in those 3 episodes of the cast review, mostly because it restricted its access to the evidence because the University of York systematic reviews that informed it made some decisions to basically hold the evidence to a standard which is not uncommon in high-stakes systematic reviews, but creates a problem for this community because it's a small community and it's not well funded and it's just there's a ragtag bunch of researchers out there trying to do their best. And so when we hold the evidence to such a high evidentiary standard, a lot of evidence doesn't make it through. And so it's very difficult then to draw conclusions from the scientific consensus, because if you're missing a bunch of the evidence, then it becomes difficult. And there are a couple of errors in the report too, which are pretty critical, misinterpretations of the literature that even misinterpretations of the systematic reviews. If you're interested, go check out our episodes on the cast review. I think they're pretty cool personally. But I got criticized a little bit because it's not a peer-reviewed publication. It's just a podcast. It's just me and thee just sitting in a room together, chilling and chatting about science. It's not a, peer-reviewed article, of course. But then in the New England Journal of Medicine, something got published. So, when we publish in this field, usually it's in pretty low impact factor journals, right? Impact factor, for those who don't know, is the number of citations that you can expect your article to be cited, given the sort of popularity of the journal, right? So if you have an impact factor of 1, it means in a year, your article published in that journal is probably going to be cited once. And that's not bad, right? Getting your article cited at all is really cool. And our best articles are cited like 20 times, maybe, in their entire existence. Hey, we're a small group of researchers. We do our best. And so when we publish in impact factor journals of 2 or 3 or 4, we're really proud. That's a good day at the office if we get into a journal like that. Journal of, impact factor of 6, 6.5. Wow. I'm popping open the bubbly for that, right? Amazing. This was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. The New England Journal of Medicine is one of the biggest journals in the world. It has an impact factor of 96. An impact factor of 96. Absolutely amazing. This is from Daniel Aaron and Craig Connoth, published just last month on January 15th. The Future of Gender-Affirming Care, a Law and Policy Perspective on the CAS review. And they go into the detail about the CAS review. They talk about, the CAS review being a bit of a challenge when it comes to gender-affirming healthcare worldwide, because it gets cited worldwide quite frequently as evidence of a more restrictive access to gender-affirming healthcare for children and young people. And it's fascinating. And the review isn't a hugely long article, but it does offer a sort of law and policy perspective, which was kind of interesting. And they said the following. An array of criticisms, they say, have been leveled at the review. Our concern here is that the review transgresses medical law, policy, and practice, which puts it at odds with all mainstream US expert guidelines. The report deviates from pharmaceutical regulatory standards in the United Kingdom, and if it had been published in the United States, where it has been invoked frequently, it would have violated federal law because the authors failed to adhere to legal requirements protecting the integrity of the scientific process. The review calls for evidentiary standards for gender-affirming care that are not applied elsewhere in pediatric medicine. The report's application of a heightened evidentiary standard probably stems in part from its deviation from standard medical scientific process. Starting in the 1950s, standard medical procedure was to subject intersex children to non-consensual irreversible genital surgery before 2 years of age to align their bodies with one side of the gender binary. Such procedures often led to chronic pain, infertility, and psychological harm, often due to gender misalignment. Mainstream medical views have shifted on both abortion access and care of intersex people, but the CAS review suggests that some actors continue to focus on policing gender in the context of transgender rights. Indeed, US gender-affirming care bans exempt intersex surgeries, which suggests that such laws are designed not to protect children, but to enforce the gender binary. The CAS review's unacceptable departures from medical law and policy are best understood in a similar way. Wow, you guys, I'm kind of blown away by such an important article published in such a prestigious journal to make such direct critiques of the CAS review. I'm glad to see it because I agree. On our first reading, we had the first kind of thought, right? Our community here, we're thinking something similar. There are some problems with the evidentiary standards that they created to set this field of literature against, and turns out those evidentiary standards are not very common in pediatric medicine and may not have been appropriate to apply here, leading to some quite conservative conclusions compared to the general scientific consensus and compared to other clinical guidelines, including the US path and the W path and the French Society for Endocrinology and Diabetology that we described last time, all having much more positive things to say about gender-affirming care than the CAS review, maybe because they considered just more of the evidence. But, as we hear more, you'll hear about it first here on Classroom Psychology. We'll take a look and see what, people have to say. But this week, we're going to do what we do every time. And this week, we're going to hear from an interesting person. We're going to hear from the legendary Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is a British evolutionary biologist, zoologist, science communicator, and author. He's Emeritus Fellow of the New College, Oxford, and was Professor for Public Understanding of Science in the University of Oxford up until 2008. So this is Richard Dawkins.
Okay, so if you have to really stretch your mind, is there any scientific backing for the concept of somebody's, like there's a woman brain and a man brain, and
there might be that. But to go from that to saying because you have a female outlook on life or something, therefore you are a woman. I mean that is just debauching language. It's one thing. It's perfectly legitimate to say I'm a man, but I feel a certain feminine attitude to things. I feel perhaps I think like a woman. That's fine. I mean that doesn't worry me at all. But to then say therefore I am a woman is just a betrayal of language. of truth and the virtues of honest communication.
Thanks so much to Richard Dawkins for such an interesting question posed, as they often are, in the form of some confident declaration. It is an interesting question, though. Right at the heart of it is the question of, brains, male brains and female brains. There is a question in here. Hey, wait, give me a second. I'll find it. There's a question about, do transgender people's brains represent the gender that they were assigned at birth, or do they represent the gender that they are transitioning to, right? That's actually a legitimate it's an extremely broad question, right? And very quickly, you and I are going to realize that the question is really problematic, because the idea of male and female brains is probably a very deep oversimplification of something that's far more complex. We're going to try and get into it together. So the question is, let's have a look. Do male and female brains exist, right? That's the first thing. Are there pink brains and blue brains? I mean, you're going to know that that's not the case very quickly. But, it's a legitimate question, right? Are there male brains and female brains? There are some brain areas, I think, that diverge between men and women. So maybe it's not as complete hokum as it seems. So let's take it for the question we're sure it's intended to be. Take it seriously. Are there male brains and are there female brains? And then more importantly, what does that mean then for transgender people, right? Do trans women have brains? Because of course, androgens and estrogen and sex hormones more broadly are going to change brains. But what happens for transgender women before they take hormones? Do their brains reflect those? Don't know what that was. Do they reflect those of cisgender men? Or do they reflect those of cisgender women? Or do they reflect something completely different, right? And for trans guys, do they reflect those of cisgender women? Or do they reflect those of cisgender men? Or do they reflect something completely different, right? So I think this is a legitimate question. You and I are going to get into it. Listen, the first thing I need to say is that this field is extremely complicated. I have been looking through this field for some time now. It's extremely complicated. I'm going to try not to bore you half to death. I'm going to try and draw out the information that is relevant and useful and simplify it so that I can understand it. Not simplify it so that you can understand it. Simplify it so that I can understand it, because I don't understand any of what I am reading. The effects of androgen production by the female fetus and estrogen binding activity of alpha fetoprotein in the female fetus leading to a feminine brain phenotype is the kind of stuff that I'm having to read for this episode. I've had to read a lot for this episode and I don't understand any of it. So I'm going to do my best to try and simplify it so that I can understand it, and then maybe you and I can find an answer to this question. Male and female brains, is that a thing? And where do trans brains fit? Let's take a look. So our first step on this tour of nightmares where I cannot understand anything is when and colleagues in 2019, what has sex got to do with it? The role of hormones in the transgender brain in neuropsychopharmacology. It's a cool piece of work. They do their very, very best. This is a great starting point. They do their very best to make sense of how male and female brains to some extent masculinize and feminize. The first thing to say before we get into any of this is that brains are a mosaic, not only of structural differences, but of functional differences and of microstructures and of the connectome, how they all connect to each other and how these different brain areas relate to each other, and then the whole brain whole brain interaction of different areas of the brain. Essentially whole brain dynamics, where you look at the brain as a whole and see how it responds to stimuli in different ways in different areas of the brain. So, before we even talk about differences between male and female brains, there are massive, brains are not one thing. you can look at very many different characteristics of brains and function of brains and of different specific brain areas and how they relate to each other in order to get a sense of what brains are and what they do and how it differs between different people. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that within all of these different kind of domains of study, the structure and function of brain areas and how they relate to each other is a mosaic in an individual, so that within two men, there are going to be some areas of the brain that look similar and some that look different. There are going to be connections that are similar and connections that are different, and that the distinction between two men, or the variability across manhood, right, of brain structures and connection and function, is a mosaic that is massively diverse, right? And there is huge overlap between your typical male brain and your typical female brain. It's a huge mosaic, even before we start talking about the transgender community. Now, and quite aside from genetic differences, there is the role of sex hormones that differentiates these brains in utero, right, before the child is born. But when the child is born, those sex hormones continue to change their brain throughout their lifetime, particularly through adolescence. So we're talking about we're talking about male and female brains. We're talking about a massive mosaic of structures and functions, which are hugely diverse within any given population, including men and women. And we're talking about brains that change over the lifespan in response to not only experience, of course, which we can't eliminate from the conversation, right? Different people have different experiences, and those change how their brains function and what their brains look like. But also, they experience the sort of sex hormones of development, and both in utero and in life, their brains change as a consequence of exposure to those hormones. So, if we're going to try and talk in sexually dimorphic terms for just a moment, bearing in mind that this is a very oversimplified way of thinking about how gender development works. But in typical cisgender guys, in utero, in the womb, as far as I can understand it, testosterone and its aromatization to estrogen, because testosterone converts to estrogen in brains, as far as I can understand it, which is wild. They cause masculinization of the fetal brain, right? So when you are in the womb, your body gets exposed to testosterone, it gets converted to some extent to estrogen in the brain, and that causes brain masculinization in inverted commas, right? And then as the child grows through adolescence, testosterone continues to do its work, and they develop more between network connectivity, larger gray matter volume, which is the kind of dense outer layer of the brain that deals with things like memory and movement and motor coordination and emotions. It's an important part of the brain. Obviously, I mean, are there parts of the brain that are not important? Who knows? I got lesions all over the place. Some of them are bound to be in places that are not that important. So they have a larger grey matter volume as a result of that masculinization. They then have a lower grey matter density. So while the volume is increased, the sort of density of neurons within there is lower. And then in adulthood, they have a larger total brain volume. They've got bigger brains. They've got more grey matter volume, more white matter volume. They have more cerebrospinal fluid volumes. They've got more of that good cerebrospinal fluid in the brain. They have a higher proportion of white matter compared to grey matter. They have a larger volume of the central subdivision of the bed nucleus striata terminalis. Wait, I'm going to have to look this up. Okay, it's an area of the amygdala, the extended amygdala, so it plays a part in stress response, anxiety, emotional processing, and sexual behaviors. So that area is larger in people whose brains have been masculinized by testosterone. They have better visuospatial and mathematical ability functionally in dudes, and they have a weaker right-hand preference. Woo! And then, of course, in the brains of typical girls have no androgen production, and the estrogen binding activity of alpha fetoprotein, which basically scoops up any peripheral estrogen that's in the brain, prevents the masculinization of the brain and causes the feminization of the fetal brain, right? Super interesting. So for dudes, testosterone gets converted in the brain to estrogen, and that causes the masculinization of the fetal brain, which is like confusing. But for girls, the absence of testosterone and therefore the absence of estrogen in the brain, and alpha fetoprotein just gobbling up all the estrogen and preventing it from having an impact on the brain, prevents it from masculinizing and causes it to feminize, which is kind of wild, right? So, the absence of estrogen is kind of the issue is kind of important, which is wild. Now, for girls, then, they have, in adolescence, more within network connectivity rather than between network connectivity. They have a lower grey matter volume compared to dudes, but they have a higher grey matter density compared to dudes. They have lower total brain volume. They have less grey matter volume, less white matter volume, less cerebrospinal fluid volume, but they have a higher proportion of grey matter. Their thicker cortex is kind of interesting. They have a higher global cerebral blood flow. They have just more blood flowing through the brain. And they have better perceptual speed and fine manual dexterity. So while guys have better visuospatial and mathematical ability, girls tend to have better perceptual speed and fine manual dexterity. Wild. They also have a stronger right-hand preference than dudes as a consequence, potentially, of feminization versus masculinization of the brain. Wild. So both testosterone and estrogen act upon the brain throughout the lifetime in ways that shape brain structures and influence function. So these influences in utero, in the womb, then are followed with influences in adolescence, and all of these change brain structure and function and do things. So the brain is a gender mosaic. Now, it's a mosaic not only in function, but it's a mosaic within boys and girls. So if we were to take a massive group of men and a massive group of women, look at their brains, we would see that, there are some differences that tend to be the case for guys and tend to be the case for girls, but those differences they overlap, right? There are differences within different men and different women that are huge, and therefore some of the typical, in inverted commas, male features of the brain are not in all men, and typical female features of the brain are not in all women. And so it gets really muddy when we try to say things like there are male brains and female brains, and therefore that has sort of consequences for thinking about what that means for transgender brains, right? So it's not as straightforward as being able to say these are male brains and these are female brains. It is a massive mosaic, right? And there are changes throughout the lifespan, which is wild. But these authors, right, specifically were looking at the neuroanatomy of transgender individuals prior to gender-affirming hormone therapy. So bearing in mind that male brains and female brains are a massive mosaic of structures and functions that do very different things to one another, and that, not all men and not all women have all the features of typical male, typical female brains, right? So it's already pretty muddy. But the question really is, what happens to transgender people, right? If trans girls, before they experience any gender-affirming hormone therapy, right? So trans girls, so people whose brains, in inverted commas, masculinized in utero, right? Like as far as we know, there's no way to know. But they had the sort of typical hormonal experience of most dudes, right? Including me, right? So my in utero experience, one assumes, was flooded with testosterone. My brain converted that into estrogen and masculinized my brain, right? That would be what would be expected. So my brain should look like any other person who experienced that in utero, right? Like, I didn't start hormone therapy until I was 28. So the question is, before I started hormone therapy, do people like me, transgender women, do our brains reflect that of typical dudes, right? Do they reflect that of cisgender men? Or is there some difference, right? That might kind of offer something of a sort of biological explanation for our gender identities, right? Can we see gender identity in the brain to some extent? I might be a bit oversimplifying it. What they find is that findings are conflicting about whether the neuroanatomy of transgender folk prior to gender-affirming hormones resembles that of the gender they were assigned at birth or of their gender identity. But most of the cross-sectional neuroimaging research, that is taking slices of the brain, like you do in an MRI, indicates that brain morphology, the structure of the brain, how it looks physically, and its activation patterns at rest and during cognitive performance are more congruent with their gender identity than the gender they were assigned at birth in untreated people who were assigned female at birth but are transgender, and in untreated people who are assigned male at birth who are transgender, which is wild, right? So they find that the sort of cross-sectional neuroimaging shows that there are brain structural and activation patterns, both at rest and during performance, that are more congruent with gender identity than with gender assigned at birth. So through their systematic review, these folks found that among transgender people, their cortical thickness, their grey matter volume, their white matter microstructure, their structural connectivity, how these areas are connected to each other, and their corpus callosum shape, which is the structure that connects the two halves of the brain right in the center. The shape of the corpus callosum has been found to be more similar to cisgender control subjects of their gender identity than those of the gender they were assigned at birth. Which is wild, right? That's wild. The structures of the brain, cortical thickness, grey matter volume, white matter microstructure, structural connectivity, and the corpus callosum shape, all found to be more similar to cisgender controls of their gender identity, not of the gender they were assigned at birth. Wild. Likewise, transgender folk have a unique pattern of connections in the resting state functional connectivity network that differ from those of the gender they're assigned at birth, right? This is before they experience any gender-affirming hormones. Transgender folk have a different pattern of connections in their functional connectivity network than those of other people assigned the same gender at birth. Now, their performance on cognitive tasks before gender-affirming hormones is also often more congruent with their gender identity, which is super interesting. So they were focused on things like verbal and spatial tasks, which, as we showed, have a bit of a clear sexual bias, right? Men tend to be better at spatial tasks, women tend to be better at verbal tasks. And they found that people assigned male at birth who are transgender, so women, trans women essentially in the world, performed significantly better on female-favouring verbal tests compared to cisgender male controls, whereas trans guys performed significantly worse than cisgender female controls on verbal tests. These authors conclude that transgender girls' feminization of their brain and the masculinization of like trans guys' brains is an innate quality that's not related to the hormonal intervention they might later receive. And I find that kind of really, really exciting. It's clearly not the case that trans girls' brains are similar to cisgender guys, even before, like, in some very specific and important ways, trans girls' brains are similar to, seemingly from this systematic review, similar to cisgender girls' brains, at least in some important ways, before gender-affirming hormones. That's fascinating. I found that super fascinating. And I find it kind of warming. I don't know why, but I do. It's sort of weirdly validating. Super cool. There are some really interesting points. They make some fascinating points that we'd not get into too heavily, but they make the point that, gender affirming hormones do support these changes as well. Like, they might enhance the transgender individual's similarity to their gender with which they identify. So they sort of support the use of gender affirming hormones for that. But they say that, listen, there's some stuff we don't understand in the detail, particularly for trans guys. They say, listen, for cisgender guys, the brain estrogenizes their testosterone through aromatization. So this chemical process changes the testosterone in the brain into estrogen, at least some of it. And estrogen then influences the brain in some important masculinizing ways. In particular, there's a cool piece of work for Cherrier and colleagues I was just reading that was looking at in healthy guys, basically, does testosterone supplementation with or without an aromatization blocker change how good they are at verbal memory and spatial memory. And they found that if they gave people testosterone, regardless of whether or not they had the chemical that prevented the conversion of testosterone to estrogen, they would be good at spatial memory, like their spatial memory improved. But only people with elevated estradiol levels who had testosterone and who were allowed to aromatize the testosterone into estrogen in their brains also experienced improvements in spatial memory, which is wild. So improving, kind of changing the testosterone levels changes the estrogen levels in the brain, and the estrogen levels has its own impact, which is super interesting. And their point, these authors' point, is that what happens to trans guys? Do trans guys implicitly do that aromatization of testosterone to estrogen in the brain? Are their brains sufficiently estrogenized to be able to properly masculinize the brain? And we just don't know because we haven't done the research yet. But that's a fascinating thought, right? Do we need to do more to support the estrogenization of testosterone in the brains of trans guys to better masculinize the brain? Have we estrogenized the brain sufficiently for these folks? Who knows? Absolutely fascinating. I find this absolutely fascinating. On to Altanay and Anand in 2020, Neuroimaging Gender Dysphoria, a novel psychobiological model in brain imaging and behavior. Again, another systematic review. They brought together 144 studies together, and 95 were reviewed more deeply. Super interesting. So these folks introduced the concept called the brain gender dissonance model. Now, interestingly, they basically say that they introduce us to the first kind of spanner in the works of our understanding here, which is to say that sexual experiences, like sexual preferences, are also represented in the brain. So, like when you are bringing together transgender women, just transgender women, to take a look at their brains, you're going to have transgender women who are gay and transgender women who are straight and transgender women who are bi or pan, and those differences are going to be represented in the brain and might confuse the picture when we're looking at brain differences between trans and cisgender folk. That's the first thing that they sort of raise it. And we're going to need to keep that in mind. It's going to be a problem as we go forward. But regardless, these folk didn't just look at kind of the cross-sectional imaging. They looked at post-mortem studies of transgender folk, which is a little bit morbid, but hey, they looked at transgender women's brain regions essential for sexual behavior, including the central nucleus of the bed of the stria terminalis, which sounds like the name of a spaceship I'd like to ride in, and the interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus, 3 and 4 volumes. Important that it's 3 and 4 volumes, not 1 and 2. 1 and 2 volumes, they're not as good. In this series of the anterior hypothalamus, books 3 and 4 are just better. They're found to be of female size. So, okay, let's break this down. So the central nucleus of the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis is part of the limbic system. It's involved in stress, anxiety, sexual behaviors, and is hypothesized to maybe be involved in gender identity. And the interstitial nuclei of the anterior hypothalamus, specifically volumes 3 and 4, are parts of the hypothalamus associated with sexual behavior, sexual orientation, and possibly gender identity as well. So essentially, they're just parts of the limbic system and of the hypothalamus, all hypothesized to be part of sexual orientation, possibly also gender identity. And they found that in these post-mortem studies that transgender women's brains were found to be of a female size in these areas, not influenced or related to her hormone replacement therapy or to sexual orientation in these studies, because they controlled for them. So they find that without HRT, transgender women's brains in these particular areas look like the brains of cisgender women, not of cisgender men. Super interesting. Now, diffuse tensor imaging, which is basically a form of MRI that looks at water distribution, I think, if I'm right. Diffusion of water molecules in the tissues. Basically, they used an MRI, essentially, a specific kind of MRI, to look at people like trans guys and trans girls, their brain microstructures before they've received hormone replacement therapy. And they found that in these diffuse tensor imaging studies, these MRIs showed that transgender women had white matter microstructure that fell somewhere between cisgender men and cisgender women. And for trans guys, they had a white matter microstructure that's far closer to cisgender men than it was to cisgender women. So again, in terms of white matter microstructure, for trans girls, somewhere between men and women, and for trans guys, very similar to typical cisgender men. Okay, listen. We can't do this. We can't go brain area by brain area, because if we continue to do this, you and I are going to start bleeding out of our ears. So what we need to do instead is to take a bit more of a broad brush approach and try to understand this systematic review and what it found in some broader terms, okay? Let's try. So they looked at some white matter and grey matter volumes. They looked at cortical thickness. They looked at the connectome, which is the structural connectivity across the entire brain. They looked at functional connectivity during tasks and resting state connectivity, not during tasks. They looked at the intrinsic network connectivity, which is the default mode network and salience networks. We'll take a look at that another time because those are super interesting. They also looked at brain activation studies with the hypothalamus activation due to erotic stimuli and voice recognition, and activation from visuospatial perception. So what did they find? They found, okay, listen, very broadly, they found that trans people's brains have distinctive features in the kind of areas of the brain and networks that are involved in self-perception, that are involved in reward, and that are involved in body representation. In some cases, trans folk end up in a different place to sort of more typical male and more typical female brains. But overall, before hormone therapy, many transgender folk demonstrate kind of brain structure connectivity and brain structure like themselves, brain structures and their connectivity, and the method, like the way in which they activate, the patterns, I guess, of their activations that veer away from the gender they're assigned at birth. In some cases, these veer toward and might become aligned with their sort of more with the gender with which they identify rather than the gender they're assigned at birth. But there's a huge amount of nuance and variability. It isn't quite as clear-cut as, transgender girls have female brains and transgender guys have male brains. But what is absolutely the case here is that in a huge number of different studies, in a huge number of different ways, transgender people's brains before hormone replacement therapy do reflect either a completely different phenotype or reflect the brains of the gender with which they identify. Not in all ways, but in some specific and important ways. Fascinating, I think. Let's go on to Uribe and colleagues in 2022. White brain dynamics differentiate among cisgender and transgender individuals. Now, these folk were particularly interested in looking not just at the picture of the entire brain in one state. They wanted to look at the entire brain's sort of fluctuations in like blood oxygen and in brain function in response to internal and external stimuli. And that allowed them to take a look at what they called the whole brain dynamic, right? The dynamics of the whole brain. And from their work, they managed to take a look at the whole brain dynamics of cisgender and transgender groups. Now, all binary, right? So transgender women, transgender men, cisgender women, and they took a look at the differences in whole brain dynamics in response to internal and external stimuli. And what they found was 4 distinct brain phenotypes. What they had before was that, maybe we could, generally speaking, differentiate brains, bearing in mind their enormous and broad mosaics into male and female. But actually, they found that there were massive differences in whole brain dynamics between men and women, but also between transgender men and cisgender men, and between transgender women and cisgender women, and between transgender women and cisgender men, and between transgender men and cisgender women. So they were completely separate, 4 completely distinct phenotypes. So it's interesting, it's not that transgender guys have, in inverted commas, typically male brains when it comes to whole brain dynamics, but it does look like transgender guys are meaningfully different. You can identify they are meaningfully different from cisgender girls, which sort of makes perfect sense, right? But it does indicate that there is some biological basis, brain basis for transgender identity. There are differences in transgender brains compared to cisgender brains. In this case, in functional kind of dynamics across the entire brain. And finally, we're going to take a look at Frigerio and colleagues in 2021, Frigerio Ballerini and Valdez Hernandez, structural, functional, and metabolic brain differences as a function of gender identity or sexual orientation, a systematic review of the human neuroimaging literature in the archives of sexual behavior. They brought together 30 studies looking at the differences in transgender folk, like in gender identity, and they looked at a bunch of different things: white matter microstructure, the structural connectome. They looked at white matter microstructure, volumetric analysis, cortical thickness, corpus callosum shape. Looked at a bunch of stuff. And they found some interesting things which do confirm what we've already seen in many cases. Though I think these folk are a little bit more cautious and a little bit less affirming in a way. They talk about like transgenders and cisgenders, like the transgenders, watch out for them transgenders. It's a little bit weird to use it as a noun, but they do that pretty consistently throughout. So it's going to, I'll try not to do it when we review it here, but they take a look and they find that when we look at the structural connectome, which is the sort of complete map of the neural connections in the brain, they find differences between cisgender and transgender populations, particularly in the right subcortical hemispheric connectivity ratio. And they take a look at I've got a nosebleed. They take a look at, so essentially, as I understand it, the structural connectome in the right subcortical hemisphere connectivity ratio is essentially looking at subcortical structures that are involved in emotions, memory, reward processing. Think like the limbic regions like amygdala, hippocampus, striatum, things like that. So, but again, we've seen this before, right? All the areas that are involved in emotions, memory, and reward processing. Super interesting. Basically, they found that, again, there are differences between cisgender and transgender populations in the kind of structural connectome in these areas. They also found differences, in inverted commas, between cisgenders and transgenders in white matter microstructure, volumetric analysis, cortical thickness, and the corpus callosum shape. In the one study that looked at the corpus callosum shape, they found that transgender people had a corpus callosum shape, which is the area of the brain that connects the two halves of the brain. That area of the brain, the shape of it, is more similar to the gender with which they identified than the gender they were assigned at birth, even before hormone therapy. Super, super interesting. Ultimately, they found that results suggest that, direct quote, although the majority of it is a podcast. I could have re-recorded that, but I won't. Although the majority of neuroanatomical, neurophysiological, and neurometabolic features in transgenders resemble those of their natal sex rather than those of their experienced gender, in the gender identity investigation in transgender women, that's not a direct quotation, it was possible to find traits which are feminine and demasculinized. And in transgender men, it was possible to find traits which are masculine and defeminized. It was, however, not possible to identify specific brain features which consistently differ between cisgender and transgender. But of course, one of the major reasons is because, they reviewed this huge 1,400 cisgender heterosexual individuals from 4 different data sets, all had MRI data. They looked at them, and this is from Joel et al. In 2015. They basically found that all brain regions and connections examined, there was a massive overlap in the distribution of traits between men and women. They could not easily clearly distinguish between male and female forms of specific brain features. So they arrived at the idea fundamentally that human brains cannot be distinctly categorized into 2 distinct classes, but that male and female brains are comprised of unique mosaics of features, which is kind of where we started, right? Some of which are more common in men and some of which are more common in women, some of which are common in both, but there is a huge overlap between typical men and typical women. So, Richard Dawkins, your answer to the question where you're like, well, there might be some evidence. Turns out, yeah, there is. Turns out there is some evidence. Listen, if you're still with me, you are one of the absolute diehard people of this podcast listening audience. Thank you so much for sticking with me through what was just absolute. Listen, my brain at the end of this podcast episode is absolutely not the same as it was when I started. I think it might now represent a sponge. I think it might now represent a small pool of bubbling liquid rather than any kind of physical form. But listen, what we have found overall as we try desperately to answer this question from Richard Dawkins, what we find in these kind of multiple systematic reviews is that brains be complicated, y'all. Brains are complicated. The first thing to say, brains are complicated. And there are lots of different ways you can look at a brain, not just in terms of different brain areas and sizes and structural differences, but also connection differences, also whole brain dynamic differences. You can take a look at microstructures as well as macrostructures. You can take a look at an awful lot. The second thing to say is that in all the research that takes a look at the differences between men and women in these areas of the brain and in these kind of structural connectome in terms of, cortical thickness, in terms of, structural differences, microstructural differences, we find that gender is a mosaic brains are a mosaic of gender features, and that typical men and typical women do have different areas of the brains that tend to be different for men and different for women, but they are not different for all men and for all women. There is massive overlap, hugely mosaic, very different. There is no clear, this is a male brain, this is a female brain. That's number 2. The third lesson here is that transgender folk do have brains that are different to the gender with which they were assigned at birth, right? So for transgender girls, their brains do, in some very important ways, like multiple different ways. We're talking about cortical thickness, gray matter volume, microstructure, white matter microstructure, structural connectivity, corpus callosum shape, in terms of whole brain dynamics, in multiple different ways. Transgender brains don't represent the brains of the gender with which they were assigned at birth. And in some ways, like for example, the corpus callosum shape, and in white matter and grey matter volume, cortical thickness, structural connectivity, task-based connectivity, resting state connectivity, the default mode and salience networks, hypothalamic activation in response to erotic stimuli and voice recognition, visuospatial perception, functional abilities in terms of verbal memory and spatial tasks. We find that in a bunch of different ways, transgender women's brains reflect more those of cisgender women than they do of cisgender men. And transgender guys' brains reflect more the brains of cisgender men than of cisgender women before they had access to hormones. This is not a consequence of hormone affirmation therapy, right? Of gender affirmation hormone therapy. These are not the consequence of hormones. These are before the effects of hormones have taken place. So in response to Richard Dawkins' question, listen, everyone, go grab yourself hot chocolate. We're going to need it all after this, I think. In response to Richard Dawkins' question, I love you so much. Thanks so much for sticking with us. In response to Richard Dawkins' question, listen, Richard, transgender people are not women because they feel like, because they think like women. It's not a question of like transgender women think, wow, I think I'm thinking like a woman. Like, who the hell thinks that, frankly, Richard? But, sure, if even if people thought, that thought I just had, that's the thought of a man right there. If people thought that, they wouldn't then, then it's not that transgender people then conclude, well, I must be a man if I'm thinking like this. That's not, I must be a woman. Wow, hey, I had thinking thoughts that are girl thoughts. Maybe I'm a girl. That's not how this works, Richard. Listen, the way that it works is that identity is the way that people experience themselves to be on the inside. That's right. That feels like home. That's what I am. It's not a question of rationalizing how I'm thinking. It's a fundamental truth of how people experience themselves to be. And these studies, these massive meta-analyses, these huge systematic reviews, all seem to suggest that there are brain differences that highlight that transgender people, might have differences in the brain that might, at least to some extent, offer some explanation as to why they might be trans. But listen, Richard, I want to go one step further and say that these brain differences don't validate anyone. That what validates people, what makes people valid, is them and their assertion. If they feel like a girl on the inside, if they feel like a boy on the inside, if they feel like, if they're non-binary entirely, if they're gender fluid, if they are demi-boys or demi-girls or any of the beautiful tapestry of gender experiences that can exist in the world, if they come to the conclusion that they are something, that's right, that's feels like home, that's what I am. If they come to the conclusion that they are something, that is what validates their experience. That is what makes them valid in the world. We listen to them and we create a world where they and everyone can find a place to belong. Thanks so very, very much for joining me. Listen, this was a hey, we had to get into it, right? We had to get into it. I hope you are feeling okay after this. Don't hesitate. You know what? Grab yourself hot chocolate, please. You know, do what you need to do. And listen, hey, thanks so much for joining us. This is Classroom Psychology. You are exceptionally welcome here. Do share this podcast with someone you think might find it useful. Hey, the bigger our community becomes, the more countries. Hey, 30 countries? You kidding me? The more people that can be part of this community and realize that we are valid in the world, especially in the world that we find ourselves in. Maybe we can, just bring a little bit more validation to the world. Thanks so much for joining me. You are very welcome here. This is Classroom Psychology. I'm your host, Cora, and I look forward to seeing you, as always, in the next one.